Is opening government here?
Actually, online debate teams are not. I'll just go in.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead with opening opposition. Rolling yield. Oh, there we go. Rolling yield is closing opposition. I'm sorry. Opening off is here, closing gov, here, closing off, here. Okay, you're just going to wait on opening gov.
Open.
It's not going to give a speech.
If you want to give a POI, please write in the check.
Listening for the online
Okay. Is opening government here? Is opening government here?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, awesome. Now all teams are here. All right, welcome to grand final. Yay! So proceeding this, so our chair, each row will be proceeding with this round. Just a quick shout out to Shikari. We don't have enough Oricom members. She's going to be doing things with the slides. Yay! So are you taking away each row?
Can they hear me from me? Or can they hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So start the debate on. Let's check the movement. This house believes that the international community should categorize rhetoric advocating the Great East Asia Prosperity Sphere as hate speech, calling on the Prime Minister. Hear you.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Cool. Just before I get started with my speech, I think Prime Minister gets the benefit of saying some thank yous. First of all, thank you to the Orcom and EAs for making hybrid possible, letting people that aren't in Japan able to participate. Thank you to my partner, Justin, for waking up until like 6 a.m. yesterday and 2 a.m. as of now. Thank you to my opponents for allowing us to have this great debate. Overall, it's been an amazing experience so far. And yeah, I'm very excited, especially because I think the first time I participated in Japan BP, I was like last in the tab. So quite nice. Cool. All right. With that said, an account. Oh, wait, please. Rhetoric surrounding Great Asia Prosperity Sphere is one that is malicious and one that is likely to antagonize whatever Western liberals that happen. First, framing. This is not a motion about banning hate speech or not. We already live in a world where the international community is certainly acknowledging certain acts as hate speech, such as slurs to certain people like minority backgrounds, or things like Nazism or imperialist values in general. Notice that opposition cannot say things about like discourse is important insofar as there are already set conditions in which international community categorizes it. This is about whether this advocacy gets into it. Firstly, why does this fulfill the criteria for what the international community should acknowledge in part of hate speech? And now, the first thing I want to do here is to classify what cold prosperity sphere looks like. It's essentially the replica of what the stance of Japan in World War II was. This accommodates three key features. First, in terms of the imperialist expansion, insofar as this served as a pretext for Japan's imperialist expansion in Asia overall. Second, it classified by military aggression insofar that often you have Japanese forces going into other countries like Vietnam or Japan, or Korea, which includes things like the Nanking Massacre or like forced comfort women in other war countries in general. But thirdly, it's just a great tool that showcases the ability of propaganda and deception. So often this concept was used as propaganda to certainly justify Japan's actions in Asia at some times. It created this false narrative of benevolence that in and of itself is harmful. So as a concept in and of itself, this is imperialist and extremely colonistic values. Secondly, why is it the people that produce this rhetoric, i.e. the LDP, have the possibility to continue this narrative in a hateful way. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, is due to the kind of historical creation of the LDP and the kind of like right incentive they have to continue the like recurring narrative they've been pushing on from the 1950s, which was when the LDP was created. It was already made during the World War II era, so it's unlikely that some kind of nuance is just gonna shift randomly just because we're in 2023. They're probably gonna be enshrining the origins and the principles that this party was made on. But secondly, is that this belief is pretty consistent with the current foreign policy stances of the LDP. If you look at the 2021 manifesto, what the LDP said, especially for things like military, it says one, to formalize the current existence of the self-defense force, but two, to raise Japan's defense budget. That means that if you take that context where it's trying to be pretty expansionist and you shed light on the kind of this like Great Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere, it means the way in which they're probably trying to advocate for this like military expansion is going to be probably in a hateful way or in the kind of similar degree of imperialist ways that they're trying to do it. Even if opposition somehow convinces you later that this is going to be pretty pacifistic, we say that there's still two external reasons in which this is going to be pretty hateful. First of all, it's probably that the media, and especially probably mediums like NHK, is probably going to shift the narrative to be pretty bad. Insofar as this is pretty a sharp word, that it's probably going to always be constantly compared to the actual sphere of what happened. So even if it's probably going to be like pretty pacifistic in the status quo, it's likely that there's always the possibility that this might be even bad. But secondly, is that the people of Japan themselves, there's a lot of people that still live between World War II. There's still a lot of people that probably experienced the war. What that means is that insofar as they've probably experienced it and they've heard that narrative, they're probably in like real life, they're probably gonna mirror the kind of narrative they heard to this specific one. So even if it itself is pacifistic, the people that are gonna be perceiving it and the audience sees it as hate speech or people that do it, and especially people or victims from other countries when they see it broadcasted in their local news station, which critically means that even if the concept itself is pacifistic, if insofar as the audience is seeing it as hate speech, means that it fulfills the hate speech condition. Because we should always err on the side of the victims and people that perceive it in a very negative light. So even if the concept itself is not hate speech, I already proved to you that the international community should condemn it insofar as we need to provide justice and make sure that any kind of
these values are not respected. The second thing I want to talk about is who is the international community, what their incentive is, and what is a good outcome that's going to happen. The first thing I want to point out is that the obligation of international community, i.e. this is probably going to look like organizations like UNICEF or perhaps other international organizations that was built on things like Bridge and Woods institutions, probably extremely democratic things that's historically condemned things like Nazism, genocide, and often is focusing on recovery from World War II and often focusing shed on like making sure that comfort women get their say in things like media. What this means, therefore, is that their incentive is to make sure this kind of narrative doesn't happen. So it's already principally and like pragmatically consistent with what they're trying to advocate for, insofar as the Great Asia Code Prosperity Sphere is pretty hateful. What then happens in which you condemn it, i.e. you probably go up to the General Assembly and say that this kind of principle is unacceptable, that the LDP needs to continue to stop it, or perhaps like Biden just tells them like bilaterally like this is a terrible idea. The first thing that happens is that Japan or the LDP will have no incentive to continue this rhetoric anymore. This is for a number of reasons. First is because they don't want to antagonize their main trade partners insofar as this threat of potential like trade partners backing out. You probably don't want to do that. But secondly, insofar as the LDP wants to continue to make sure that like seem like it's doing okay domestically and internationally, especially with heightened tensions with China and Korea right now, they're probably going to be more understanding insofar as they want to continue to win the elections in the next cycle, especially because their voting retention or like acceptance rate of the prime minister right now is pretty low, which critically means that you're probably not going to continue this rhetoric anymore. There's a couple of benefits to this that goes beyond the principle that I talked about. The first benefit is that probably you provide solace to especially victims that experienced World War II, especially because the kind of stories they like want to share about things like being a comfort woman is hidden from media. Things like education does not cover it. There's no one that really supports them except for maybe a local media, for instance. But if the international community is backing you up saying what happened in World War II was terrible, you're more likely to get comfort and solace, and that in and of itself weighs out any kind of benefit or any kind of obligation that opposition is going to say, because they're the ones that actually suffered during this time. But the second unique impact of what happens is just productive discourse, i.e. the discourse becomes significantly better when we issue these issues with a negative light from the first place. I'm going to preempt OO, which is the whole idea that, look, probably like it's better if you don't classify as hate speech, let people talk about it and have discourse. But the problem with current forms of discourse is that it's very asymmetrical and very unbalanced. i.e., probably the governments have a monopoly over what you're able to say. The LDP is able to control the narrative that comes out. So you uniquely need the backing of the international community, especially in the perspective of victim, to say your story, because otherwise you do not get an avenue to give whatever you want to. So if as soon as you approach this with a pretty hateful, negative way, that's probably better in terms of having more discourse about it. Therefore, OG wins for very simple reasons. Firstly, because this is innately hate speech, and even if it's not, insofar as people perceive this to be hate speech, that is the precondition and the criteria for categorizing this as hate speech. But secondly, there are pragmatic benefits both to discourse and providing comfort to women for the first time that has continued to be neglected over the 60 to 70 years of history. Very, very happy to propose.
Thank you for that. Their officer.
Oh, okay, great. That's better. I'm so sorry. I think my Discord malfunctioned for a bit. Am I audible right now? Hello? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So, uh, hi, I'm Athena. Uh, I'll, I have no preferred pronouns. Be wise through voice. If you have, and yeah, I just I won't be looking at the chat, so please make sure to just interrupt my speech. Otherwise, well, firstly, thank you to Orgum for the tournament. Thank you, Sir Phil, for inviting me to join this tournament. But yeah, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, please note that in opposition, we are not condoning Japan's actions in Asia during the war. We recognize the crimes of the empire and their malicious intentions to aggressively expand at the cost of the lives of many others in the region, right? But we think there's also a possibility for us to have a healthy and nuanced discussion which people are able to understand on the ground about what the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is and how designating it as hate speech will actually fuel more fires in the burgeoning far right sentiments that is present in the Japanese government right now, right? Firstly, we think that in status quo where there may still be some wounds that are unhealed, but I think that we are also having precautions, right? Like how Japan has limits in its militarization, for example, the existence of ASEAN as a regional counterbalance, NATO, to also discourage Japanese imperialist sentiments. And even if there is a far right resurgence in your political landscape, I think Japan in general they teach in schools that war is bad, and there is therefore no widespread societal support for them actually inciting conflict. Right? People generally want peace. We think then that if we prove that designating it as hate speech would do more harm than good is a simple burden that opposition can fulfill to win this debate, right? Especially when the actor doing it is the international community. All rebuttals will be integrated throughout. Because we tell you that when you actually immediately designate or categorize this rhetoric, advocating for it as hate speech, you miss the nuances as to why people are referring back to the historical narrative, right? And you prevent people from actually engaging in discourse about it, right? Because take note that this narrative was originally created to counter Western aggression, like systemic Western expansion in Asia at the time, right? We think that it's easy for people to misconstrue the also current Western hegemony now as the same, and this is the easiest reference for them to like see how their country was previously affected by such political actions from the international actors, right? But when the moment that you designate it as hate speech, there's going to be a lack of constructive corrective mechanisms that's going to be able to explain it to them why this narrative is actually harmful, how this narrative was actually used for cruel means. They will, and in the absent these constructive corrective mechanisms, these people will actually be unable to realize why it's wrong, right? We think there's this lack of corrective mechanism because when you label something as hate speech, it discourages any engagement with the term. So it means that less people are actually interested in discussing it to preserve their image or reputation, for example, right? But secondly, there's really isn't much room left to explain why something is hate speech. People are generally expected to just abide with the rule of not being able to say it. So even if government claims that you're able to improve discourse when you preface the discussion with a negative light, that already confuses people, that already has the effect of people being discouraged from engaging with it, right? But I think there's also a more important like level of analysis, which is that when you try to designate something as hate speech, when you put it within a controversial label, it will actually make it more like famous, for example, right, or what more well known, or make people more intrigued to like make more people like intrigued about it, especially if the actor is the international community, because you allow the burgeoning far right groups to play the victim and play the sympathy cards, right? They tell us that the LDP will have no incentive to bring up this rhetoric anymore, but I think this is untrue. We think it's actually unlikely to reignite their already existing nationalist sympathizers by pointing out how the external international community is dictating how they get to tell their own history. You further polarization and get Trump-like unconditional support for these far-right politicians because they're able to run this narrative of how they are the victims, right? But note also the reason why perhaps there are like anti-West sentiments, right? Because the U.S. is trying to establish a hegemon, and we think that there are valid concerns as to how Japan is affected by it, how their countries are affected by it. But you lessen the likelihood of validating their discussions and their sentiments about Western aggression and hegemony, because their like sentiments will easily be likened to the advocacy of the prosperity sphere, right? Because it's the easiest historical reference for them to latch onto. Note how, like, even if we note how, if you really want justice, there are ways to do it. Japan can start by recognizing explicitly the crimes they committed in Nanking, for example, like installing reparations for comfort women, having direct material reparations for the victims, for the survivors, for example, of their atrocities during the war. But also note that this is like that the Greek prosperity sphere is different later from any Aryan supremacy doctrine that they may like that Gov may like compare it to, because that anti-Semitic advocacy or ideology directly targets a minority. In this case, early Japanese resistance against systematic exploitation from the West meant they aren't actually going against a minority, they're going against a systemic being. But also note, but before my last extension go, POI.
Discourse on its educational context is significantly better when you allow it to just happen in a historical context and not when you use it as a metaphor for explaining foreign policy that dilutes the possibility of talking it in an educational way.
Okay, but that leads me to my next point, right? Even when it's used in a foreign policy way, let's look at international relations realistically, right? The same reason why there is no credence to the river to the sea narrative from Palestine being claimed as an Islamist narrative for expansion is because we know that Hamas doesn't actually have the capacity to do this. The same reason why we don't actually like there's actually little harm, like not as big of a harm like in like actually using it in foreign policy is because we know that Japan isn't going to like it's unlikely for Japan to actually succeed in like imperialist expansion and status quo. Japan might be able to formalize its current standing military, right? But given the current regional security landscape, the giant that is China, the instability and unpredictability of North Korea, and the existence of greater Western powers simply won't let it realistically happen. So, but we think what the difference is at least we enable like people on the ground to have constructive like engagement, to have like nuance and constructive discourse regarding regarding this particular ideology, right? Obviously, they already know war is bad. They don't want to be punished the same way they were punished after World War II, for example. But at least you allow for the existence of constructive corrective mechanisms because you don't immediately designate it as hate speech. At least you don't give the LDP another weapon to paint the international community as always unfaithful actors and allow them to play the sympathy cards. Might give them more like credence and actually furthering their far right tendencies. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Yes, you're on.
I'm gonna take the IT chat. I'm only gonna take from closing. The very reason why this motion is still something debatable is because of our ignorance that we refuse to associate what Japan did in the past to its ex-colonies in East and Southeast Asia, and we refuse to see that in such a negative light that what the Nazis did against the Jews. We would argue that insofar as the actions that were done in the past incite similar or even larger scale of harm, that is, it is by definition a hate crime. That's going to be the first thing that I'm going to answer in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to also talk about why, regardless of whether or not it should be like it is in and of itself a hate speech, why then should we try to categorize it as hate speech in a pragmatic sense? Firstly, is it by definition a hate speech? Like in the past, obviously it is a hate speech, right? Like this is probably comparable to what the swastika symbol, symbolizing the genocide of millions of Jews and the slaughter of the Eastern Europe, for example, during the Communist Revolution in Soviet. What did the rhetoric motivate or justify Japan to do in the past? At least four things. The first is a massive expansion and militarization of young Japanese individuals, leading to their own downfall and death, leading them to sacrifice their life to fight a war that they know that they will never be able to win to begin with. Secondly, the persecution of Southeast Asian and East Asian individuals, forcing them into slavery and unconsented sex worker or comfort women called jugunienfu in a lot of these like young women, for example, in these specific countries. Thirdly, it's a massive militarization and displacement of ex-colony people to fight Japan's war against the West at the fake promise of providing independence or autonomy that they never really intended to give to begin with, insofar as the primary reason why they want to expand is because they want to be the leader of Asia. They want to make this kinds of like a sphere or whatever that was like symbolized by the existence of this ideology to begin with. But lastly, it's obviously just a mass murder of people who stood up and fought for their lives and agency because they are sick and tired of being enslaved by this foreign imperial. The worst part is Japan did not need to do this at all, i.e. they struck first and participated in World War II unprovoked, i.e. in 1941 when they invaded things like Pearl Harbor. So they couldn't really defend themselves by claiming a legitimate argument of self-defense in a way that, they initiated the conflict by themselves because of the fascist propaganda in the past. Insofar as a lot of older people in like Indonesia, for example, still hate what the Japan imperials did, then I think this provides even more assault to their dignity. For example, if you keep on talking about this as if this is something normal, as if this is something that is acceptable, and you're trying to justify harm that it's okay that I enslave your parents, for example. It's okay that I force you out of school because necessarily that's what we needed to do at the specific point. We think that in and of itself that incites extreme emotion, that incites extreme trauma, and that should be in and of itself a hate speech. But the second thing I want to highlight is also the intent part of the debate, i.e., when the LDP says or attempts to relieve this ideology, it is based on the knowledge that they can utilize the radical nationalism of Japanese individuals to support whatever foreign policy that they might propose on the basis of defending their country, while also intentionally inciting fear and pain to the ex-colonies to begin with. Even if this is not intentional, this is at best negligence, i.e., this is equally as bad because they know that the impacts of their statements that they make in press conference, for example, or whatever it is, the publication that their country probably make against their covering their own foreign policy, is probably something that's going to be accessible for a lot of their ex-colonies as well, who probably still have a lot of bad blood regarding this. So insofar as they intentionally try to make this some sort of a hate speech to incite inciting fear and dominance against their ex-colony, in and of itself we think that it constitutes a definition of a hate speech. But secondly, even if you don't believe any of that, let's talk about pragmatism. Why should we categorize this as hate speech to begin with? The first thing that I would suggest is discourse, and I will argue that discourse gets substantially better in Gulf. And the reason for that is because, again, little to no response from their side. We don't get a lot of people from the other end debating on justifying that this was a legitimate thing to do, which might often be triggering and often insensitive for a lot of individuals on the other side of it. I think what opening opposition claimed was like opening opposition tried to dismiss our preemptive by saying that putting negative light does not really do anything; it just confuses people. But I think what we uniquely do for opening government is that we the initially negative light towards this ideology and a general consensus that we should attempt to say that it is something acceptable is a good thing, i.e., because we can no longer say that this is subjectively acceptable or subjectively good for some individual, but only that this is objectively unacceptable, right? We create an international moral standard, that international law that's called jus cogens, that is to say an acceptable or a morally acceptable international norm, and therefore insofar as international community already claims it is something that is bad and unacceptable to begin with, people who try to justify that this might be a right thing will be alienated and will be considered as the outlier within the discourse. But even if we have less discourse in the worst case scenario, that's okay. Why? Because we ought are on the side of the victims who might not want this, who might not want to be reminded by this trauma that they had 70 years ago, for example, in the past. And insofar as they're probably the ones who are most vulnerable and most impacted by what the Japanese imperialists did in the past, that's probably something that is good in our side. But the second way we do this is also through education, i.e., the reception of the modern day Japan of its past compared to, say, Germany has been very different. Because the reason for that is it's very difficult to acknowledge that your country did some nasty stuff in the past if you were always taught that all those were justified, compounded by the radical nationalism tendency. Absent a powerful narrative that can burst out of the bubble of ignorance, you're never going to be able to opt out of that particular understanding. This does two things. The first is that at least we give a powerful counterbalance that is from international community, i.e. that also influences how the school curriculum ought to be made. But secondly, I think LDP can no longer dilute the meaning of this narrative in a metaphorical sense, insofar as that I think in opposition you will confuse people even more, insofar as people are unable to necessarily understand what the narrative probably means, especially if you try to if you try to sort of dilute it in a way that you're creating a status quo, i.e., all the arguments for opening opposition about giving reparations to their ex-colony, the ignorantly claim without mechanizing, is probably accessible in our side. Insofar as if a lot of people learn it from their childhood that my country did something bad, then it creates even more democratic push for the government to actually do something, as opposed to that if they always stay in the bubble of nationalistic tendency and just ignoring everything that their country did in the past. You have little to no push from their side to want to do something like this. But lastly, I would argue that the idea of triggering more far right movement from their side is just extremely dismissive to our characterization, right? Japan does not have the interest nor the capacity to full on go against the West or other parts of the world right now. They're facing a lot of social crisis, i.e., because of the aging population that might lead to other social problems, budget allocation, for example, for healthcare and pension funds and stuff like that. And therefore, insofar as Japan is also currently struggling, it's unlikely that they are trying to be more stubborn. They're trying to be more open in our side of the house. They're trying to acknowledge that they did something in the past. They're trying to make it up, and I think that creates a better word for both Japanese people and for everyone, ex-colonies, for example. And for all those reasons,
Thank you for that, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hello. I'm gonna make a disclaimer because we're not supposed to talk about Japanese politics, you know, as ALTs, and I might get kicked out. But these aren't necessarily my views. Hopefully, that's legally binding. Hello. Okay. All right. It's a very sensitive topic. Sensitive as the what about porn? Anyway, let's start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So what opposition bench presented in this debate was very clear. We're against equating the rhetoric as hate speech because we believe that doing so is going to be too extreme and it's counterintuitive. Never mind that my leader of opposition has provided discussions about its implications. I'm going to further extend to that. But before I do it, let's discuss the case given to us by government. First, they talked about how this rhetoric will be used as propaganda to justify Japan's actions. That this is inherently a hateful message and it's not pacifistic because like media like the NHK will probably shift the narrative. Number one, there's no discussion about what this shift looks like and how it will happen. But also there's this weird assumption, immediate assumption, that it won't be met with any pushback or criticism at all. Like counter narratives still exist in status quo. That's why my leader of opposition told you that there are other messages that also exist and there are also other actions that already address your concerns about the victims. For example, there are reparations that have been done or that is still being done, for example. So there are corrective measures that happen in status quo. Second of all, they talked about how it's the obligation of the international community to promote democracy and condone genocide and other human rights, to go against things that condone genocide and other human rights violations. We think that these can still be done without equating this rhetoric to hate speech. This goal will still be preserved in opposition, and it will maybe and that's something that I will further discuss later in my speech. And lastly, they talked about how if you label it as hate speech, there will be no incentive to pursue this rhetoric anymore. I think Ina was able to prove to you later how this will be counterintuitive because it will make these extremist individuals play the sympathy card. Therefore, they can weaponize that hate speech label in order to gather more sympathizers, right? But also, lastly, in DPM's case, there's this weird assumption that because of this rhetoric, the abuse of comfort women, slavery, oppression, the displacement of people due to the World War, and these deaths become justified. That's so weird. No, there was a weird logical leap there. And that's not what we're defending. If this rhetoric were to lead into something tangible, I don't think that it will take the same form as it did before because the landscape has changed as it was in the past, right? Everyone's memory and idea of the war is still very fresh due to many things that constantly remind us of it, right? That's why it's also heavily embedded in educational systems all over the world, right? Later. What it leads to is to show that what this rhetoric leads to is to show that evil forces that threaten cultural identity take a different form or still exist. You don't need a war to have a villain. So what you're highlighting is the goal of the now defunct supranational body, which is the East Asia Co-Prosperity Spheres goal, which is to be wary of actors that have the tendency to be hegemonic. And that threat still looks true in status quo. Like if you take a look at superpowers like the US, China, Russia, for example, there is still this threat of them wanting to become hegemon. And the positive rhetoric about the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which is about being wary of precisely these actors that we're talking about, still remains valid. So we don't think that by we think that it's unfair to label it as hate speech when in fact there are legitimate aspects to it that still apply in the present world. So there are ways of addressing the war crimes that they're talking about, right? And they say that recognizing the crimes of World War II necessarily requires designating the sphere as hate speech. But no, you can get justice by acknowledging and apologizing for the crimes directly. The ideology has sympathizers, so it will make it easier for extremists to defend, right? So crimes are very easy to see as bad, right? So what about the victims that they're concerned with? I think we've already we've already responded to that. Now let's talk about my case in government, in opposition bench. Number one,
what happens when you equate it to hate speech. Sorry, then that means that it's weird because you when you classify something as hate speech, it means that something incites violence or pushes for violent thoughts, right? You punish them, punishing it equates to hate speech become a weapon because you give these extremists ammunition to gather more supporters, right? You gather even more support from the people and even from other East Asian states and states outside Asia that have anti-US sentiments. And this responds to government's claim that equating it to hate speech will discourage people from pursuing the idea, right? You'll see this creates the opposite effect, something that government was so afraid will happen. We think it's not strategic and it blocks inclusive discourse. Never mind the fact that the international community is the one micromanaging how the Japanese should see the current international dynamics. Because, like I said, these threats of hegemon still exist in status quo. So, sorry, government, this is still about whether the discourse is important or not. Specifically, this type of discourse, especially when you say there are individuals that are sympathetic to these views. If you discourage them from voicing out, it prevents the opportunity for them to be countered. So, in their heads, they will still think that they are correct, right? This discourse is different from the discourse that exists in schools because you only limit that discussion to academics and you will get the criticism that it doesn't accommodate the views of regular people or even other people in society outside school, right? So we think that this also invalidates other points that are actually still legitimate in status quo. Yes, your point. Three.
International community nonetheless condemns Nazi symbols, even if it might lead to a neo-Nazist party, because we outweigh on protecting a solace of Jews. In the same way, the traumatic memories of those experienced being a comfort woman should be outweighed over a superficial random extremist typing something on Twitter or whatever impact you want them to say.
Okay, number one, I think that the response to the victims of abuse against comfort women is already addressed through reparations, and we're still continuously doing that. But second of all, I don't think it's fair to equate this rhetoric to anti-Semitism because it's obviously a totally different scenario. When you talk about like Hitler, there was ethnic cleansing, there was a cleansing of a race, right? And we think that that was directly targeted to one specific minority. It's different with the World War because you're talking about different powers that exist. It's very difficult to pinpoint which one is the minority here or not. But regardless, we still think that you have to go back to the current goal of this institution, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It's about becoming wary of actors that could possibly step into your sovereignty and might become a hegemon, controlling other policies and other views, and might also eliminate an entire cultural identity. We think that this is still valid. We're very proud to extend. Thank you.
For that, member of government.
Can you like step up, like step one step back and not speak too closely to the mic? Yeah.
Is this good?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay. For the people in phone line, I will look on it. The like opening government for maybe leader position. Am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay, great. Just one simple clarification. If you want to make choice for the people who in this room, right, the closing opposition and also the deputy leader opposition, please just stand up. Do not vocalize the voice. But if the leader opposition want to give point, just voice out. Because I will not be able to see the chat. Huh. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair and panels, we say that the opening government's strongest claim was the idea from the DPM, that we have to deal with this ignorance of the Japanese people in order for us to have this nice relationship with Japan and Asian people, because this was the biggest argument that has a practical benefit both in terms of Asia but also in terms of Japan, right? But I think that they lack in many mechanisms, and therefore what we are going to do from the member of the government is to do the legwork. Why that practical analysis is actually going to be done in the first place. Therefore, I'm going to go cross three things. Firstly, why the past injustices by the Japan are likely to be forgotten from the Japanese people in the first place. But secondly, why the international criticism can light awareness in the first light awareness. But lastly, why this lighting awareness is critically important when when Japan cultivate the relationship with Asian society. One by one. Firstly, what is past injustice? Why is past injustices by Japan are likely to be forgotten from Japanese memory, right? If this problem was just the person in LDP was stupid, we don't think that this is really important problem, right? But we say that the reason that it is problematic is that majority of the Japanese people forgot these past injustices that Japanese people made against Asian communities or whatsoever, right? In that situation, I think that the opening government never explained why that is the case, and therefore I'm going to explain five different reasons why that is the case, right? Firstly, we see that there's less proof of injustice, right? We see that the past Japanese government already destroyed these proof of these injustices in the first place, and in that situation, it's quite difficult for this Asian community to claim these past injustices in the first place, right? And also, we see that these proof of injustices are not likely to be put into these for example, the books or whatsoever in the first place. And in that situation, we think that the people are likely to forget these past injustices. But secondly, perpetrator can just simply forget their crimes, right? Because benefit of the perpetrator is something that's quite temporary in the first place, and in that situation, they don't have that much incentive to remember that in the long run. But sadly, we see that the people don't want to feel that they are villains, right? Because feeling guilt is something that's uncomfortable, and therefore they want to opt out from these feelings. But fourthly, Japanese people uniquely feel that they are rather victims of the war. They feel that they are victims of a nuclear war, a nuclear weapons or whatsoever, and therefore they forgot that they are also the perpetrator in the first place. Right? In that situation, the idea that you are also perpetrator are likely to be forgotten from Japanese people. But lastly, less international pressure, right? Because even in neither parliament, we think that Asian communities are anyway going to be pissed off by Japanese South Koreans maybe sometimes pissed off or whatsoever. But we say that because this criticism is not so broadly in the first place, right? Especially this Western country is not aligned with this criticism in the first place. And in that situation, Japanese government doesn't have that much incentive to listen to this criticism in the first place. Why then in that part this international criticism can rise up awareness in the first place? We say that in that part, we think that the international criticism, especially centered from the West, are likely to be really detrimental for the Japanese government incentive. This is because of three reasons. One, because Japan relied on on other countries, right, in terms of imports or in terms of exports or in terms of their national defense or whatsoever in the first place, right? In that situation, because they cannot be independent, we think that they don't have that incentive not to make other countries piss in the first place. Not yet. But two, we think that Japan has a relation against the West in the first place. Japan thinks the West is really great in the first place, and in that situation, they have the incentive to care about the criticism from the West in the first place. But sadly, we think that Japan wants to be member of the UN Security Council, right? We think that Japan has the incentive to be hegemony in the first place, and on the one of the steps, they have the incentive to engage in this UN Security Council in the first place, right? In that situation, they have the incentive to make this hegemony piss in the first place, and therefore they have the incentive to listen to this criticism in the first place, right? In that situation, we say that when international society strongly criticize these Japanese ignorance, we think that that's things that are likely to be changed. For example, Japan might have the incentive to just change these the content of these curriculums or whatsoever, or maybe at least in our part there's going to be a media broadcast about whether that thing is true or not. And in that situation, we think that this awareness of these Japanese people about their past injustices are likely to be increased in the first place. Why it has to be done in forms of hate speech? This is simply because calling them as hate speech is the strongest criticism that is possible in the first place, and therefore we think that is good. The analogy here is a BBC's broadcast against the Chinese entertainment, right? Before the BBC's criticism, majority of the Japanese people tend to forget what Chinese what Japanese did, right? Trying to like deny these kind of like Japanese like abuse in the first place, right? But right after this kind of BBC's criticism, Japanese suddenly started to criticize these kind of like Japanese like bad actions in the first place, right? In that situation, we say that these kind of criticism from the West are really like effective in Japan, especially in terms of like in terms of the context of Japan, and therefore we think that we can uniquely rise awareness of these kind of past injustices. Before moving on, yes.
Well, you said that they already feel like victims. Exactly the point. You further that complex when the international community does something the LDP can easily label as oppressive.
Even if this is going to increase this kind of like the feeling of that you are like you are the like victims at the moment that at the same moment that you are going to feel that you are also perpetrating in the first place. This is crucially important for us to have the negotiation against the Asian community in the first place. Therefore, I think the outline is much more better. Then why Naparan? Why this like rising of awareness is critically important for the Japanese Japan to cultivate relationship with Asian society, right? Because what we have to note here is that people in Asia remember these past injustices, right? Because pain is more proximate to them, and also some injustices remain these scarred even in a status quo, right? In that situation, when they see Japanese people forgetting these kind of like past injustices, they feel angry in the first place. They feel less incentive to cooperate with Japanese like government or Japanese like any like actors in the first place, right? In that situation, we say in their part of the relationship of Japanese and like Asian countries are likely to fail. In our part, because Japan can just like Japan can just recognize their past injustices and just say sorry for this kind of thing. And in that situation, that's a unique moment that we can have this kind of friendly relationship with Asian community. Why having this kind of Asian community like tie with Asian community really important? This is precisely because Japan are in aging society, right? In that situation, the industry of Japan is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And in that situation, Japan has to export their product to like foreign country, and considering this geopolitical like process, it is quite important for them to have the like a relationship with Asian society. And by all of these reasons, I'm happy to propose.
Thank you for that. Calling on member of opposition.
Right. So yeah, I'm not able to online videos. Okay. Right. Let's start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Because I'm a philosophy nerd, the first extension will be about principle, and the second extension is about polarization, basically more mechanism and impact in this debate. But before we move on to these points, I'll just point out like the flaws of the CG. Basically, they say that the trade like the will happen for, but currently like the Japan has no problem with the trading, right? There are so many trading partners in the current situation. What they do basically is to create a new problem, and then they are saying that the government will overcome this problem. And I don't understand why it succeeds or why it's meaningful, right? But I will also engage to their point why education will not happen at the point of polarization. So firstly, about the principle argument. The most important thing to clarify here is that government has to bite the bullet. That is to say, they have to defend the old narratives. Why, like the people, we are justified to, equate all kinds of narratives regarding this, like the concept to the hate speech, right? Basically, the OG says it's likely to be violent, or it's likely to be bad, but it's not enough to prove the principal claim of the OG, right? So the reason why this the narrative is not the hate speech is because this narrative is not saying Japan should go back to World War II era and do the same thing to admit and achieve the goal, right? Basically, this policy or concept is the goal, right? We are not saying that we should take the same process to leads to that goal, right? We're just saying that the goal itself is good, right? Basically, this narrative is saying that the advocating for this, like the policy is good, right? That's why even if they talk about how the process was bad in the past, it is meaningless because basically we're talking about why, like, it is, advocating for this goal itself is principally, unjustified or not. But the second reason why this is not hate speech, is because I want to explain the criteria of hate speech, which basically government didn't explain. The first thing is I think that it targets certain groups of individuals. But second criteria here is that the emotion or intention of the speaker significantly matter, right? Because it's necessary condition to distinguish, just accident, saying from the emotionalized or hate speech, which basically literally says that emotion of the speaker matters, right? Hate speech doesn't apply. Like this narrative doesn't apply to this criteria because it doesn't target the specific groups because basically that's the goal that we should achieve, right? But secondly, like it is not intended, at least sometimes, right? Like I admit that there are some cases that these are used as the hate speech, but it doesn't mean that this narrative itself should be categorized as hate speech. For those reasons, we proved principally that this is not a hate speech. And when here is that the practical argument, like all kinds of the practical argument, is a little bit like the less unique, right? Like we can achieve the same goal, like without just categorizing, like the hate speech. Basically, we can like just criticize this kind of concept. The reason why principle argument matters is because it is the most direct, like like the answer to the motion. That's why philosophy matters. So the next extension is about the polarization. Basically, OO was very, very, like the lazy to explain the mechanism. Why basically like pro like the Great East Asia like full prosperity sphere will spread or will be dominant like in Japan, right? So I will provide 5 mechanisms for here. So firstly, conservative people have capacity to do this. Since this, Great East Asia full prosperity sphere is very, very vague, they can cherry pick, like the points that, positive points of the project. That's why, in the first place, these conservative people or certain people have, capacity to create these kind of like the narrative. But secondly, Japanese people tend to have strong nationalism, and they never never recognize this point, right? There are several reasons for this. The first is that the homogeneous culture or people. Basically, there are people who have almost the same, culture and backgrounds and like the, ethnicity. That's why there is the echo chamber, right? And basically, they often like to have this strong nationalism because of this point. There are just people who came into Japan, for example. But second thing is that the constant indoctrination that Japan is great, right? There are so many, TV programs, for example, that emphasize the positive part of Japan, for example. Basically, they tend to, create nationalism because of those reasons, right? Which is the most important mechanism for the opposition side. But third reason or third mechanism is that media prefers like like this GAC as like narratives because people like who pay for these media tends to be elderly people, like young people don't really see the TV or newspapers, for example. That's why like the media have the incentive to cater to these like older people who often have the experience of World War II, for example, which basically have the more stronger nationalism and the like this like the narratives. But secondly, also like the people inside the media tends to have the that tends to be older, for example, or have more nationalism. That's why they tends to create spread like the pro narratives rather than anti narratives among in the international sphere. But the fourth reason here is that the Japanese government will never raise this topic, and this is directly clashing to Oshi and like Seishi, right? The reason why it is the case is because as Oji explained, there is a dilemma, right? Like for the international community, we don't want to use this narrative. But basically, as we explained, like in Japan, like we want to use this kind of narrative. But before we move on, I'll take opening if you have.
Even if the concept itself is not hate speech, if the most vulnerable individuals like Korean or Indonesian victims feel that the sphere is targeted to them and they have to relive humiliating memories, isn't it the obligation of the international community to protect their interests the most?
To prove that point, you had to explain the most like the moderate moderate version of this narrative is also like the hurting like the vulnerable individuals. Without that, your principle doesn't stand. So the Japanese government will not be able to talk about this concept because to the international community you don't want to use it, but to the national community you want to use it, which means that the Japanese government will refrain from talking about these issues, for example, in the education or in any other parts, which is basically the direct rebuttal to CG. So the impact here is that firstly, aggressive discrimination against minority people in Japan will exist more on our side, more on their side of the house, right? There are minority people who came from other countries, for example, and there is people who have an incentive to directly attack these individuals. But secondly, aggressions in social media. The reason why it's more impactful than what Oshi talks about is because people will get disappointed to people, right? Even if you get disappointed to government, it's not that hurtful. But when you get disappointed to Japanese people, you have the more significant mental damage. For those reasons, proud of those.
Thank you for that. Government whip.
Am I audible? Right, thank you. So firstly, I'm going to explain why Yohei's extension was really significant in this debate. Yohei explained the mechanism as to why we can actually grant the benefit that like opening up and failed to explain. What are they? Yohei explained firstly, under status quo, the vast majority of cases, the Japanese people don't know the past crime that they actually committed in the past, right? A lot of Japanese people think that they're victims of America in the war, right? Japanese people don't think and don't even know that they invaded in Korea or like the Philippines or Indonesia, for example. They don't feel any guilt because they were the victims, right? And we think that is very, very problematic, which we want to solve, right? The mechanism you have provided is that we don't know because we don't really teach them in the details in the history class, and we don't really have the kind of narrative under the status quo. And we prove to you that we can make Japanese people understand the past tragedy happened and was there something wrong in the past. Because if we broadcast it in the media, because it's hate speech, it's sensational, like they said before, maybe we expect some backfire. We don't really care because which is really important for make Japanese people understand, and some people, that we did something wrong, right? That make people and why this is important, right? Because under the status quo, Japan is an aging society. We need a lot of people for nursery, for like English education, but not right, or like farming, for example, that are essential for our economy, for essential fundamental rights to be protected. And we need foreigners because people don't make babies, and this is the only way for us to invite people. But on their side of the house, right, people don't know if they did something wrong in the past. So I think that people will just say like we are victims, like we didn't do anything wrong in the past. And if Filipino people come to Japan, they hear it, they feel so depressed. And what they want Japanese people to say is to sorry, but they will justify it with the past injustice. And I think they will that will make them leave out of Japan, which is really significant, right? Because opening government, the best case is like they will have better discourse and they'll be able to protect traumas. First of all, discourse, I don't think it was impacted. Secondly, about trauma, I think like it's very, very tiny people will be impacted on their side of the house, right? Because people who experience the war is very, very minor, but we are talking about the vast majority of Japanese people who are living in Japan, who have to have somebody who are doing nursing, who have to do something for me, for example. And I think we'll be able to like attract more people on their side of the house because like a lot of foreigners like Japan, but it's just that they want Japanese people to understand what they did in the past was really wrong, which I think by only on their side of the house that we can actually send a signal and make the Japanese people understand because it's a really shocking story, right? And what they said was like, like we can actually do that like on their side of the house to make Japanese people understand what they did was wrong. But like, they said that media is conservative on their side of the house. I don't know how they will be able to like conduct education on their side of the house, right? I think it's unique, and even if that's not unique, we don't really care because we provide some benefits by actually like making it putting it hate speech. So let me then engage with closing opposition. Firstly, they talk about like according to the dictionary, this is not hate speech. Like, first of all, I'm sorry, I don't really fucking care about the definition of like what hate speech is. And it's not even a principal argument. It's just talking about definition. Like I think that it's nonsense. And moreover, like definition is not that they intend to harm other people or not, right? Like swastika or skinhead
even if they are not intended to harm other people, and some people still like to, be skinhead, for example, it is still like hate speech in Europe. So I don't necessarily understand if they understand the meaning or definition of hate speech on their side of us as well, right? And finally, they said that like conservative media will backfire. And firstly, I think I think I said it in round one when we met. Liberal media exists. It's not just that the conservative media. It's it's all over in Japan. Like there, 50% of population, like I said before, in round one, they are liberal. So like people have the incentive to cater to like liberal people. So liberal media will sensationalize it and then criticize the Japanese government. They criticize the politician who actually make the kind of speech and they call them out by like doing the kind of hate speech, which I think is really the case, right? So I think that even if backfires, I think there will be some people to be able to understand it because Japanese people don't really want to be like, they don't want to be justify it. It's just that they don't know it, so they have to justify it. If we can actually make them know, I think it's less likely that they will be like justifying if they know what they did was really wrong. And I think that they will be able to know it because it's going to be on like social media, it's going to be on news, and like they will like point out what they did was wrong. And I think this is the education mechanism. We don't really have to put it in our education. Yes.
Why is the call-out mechanism existing in status quo? Not enough. But second of all, you said they had to almost completely dismantle their military, and now you're also telling them what teachers can and cannot talk about in their schools, what politicians can discuss. Doesn't that make them even further the victimization narrative?
Okay. So I'm gonna engage with your case, right? You said that it's going to backfire then like a lot of Japanese people who were angry. But like let's look at the capitalization of an international body. That is to say, we think it is basically America. And like what you have to understand is that Japan is like a little brother of America. We have to always obey what America says, right? For example, like we have like a lot of like military bases in Okinawa, and a lot of the budget are actually spending from the pocket of the Japanese government and not from the American military. So if America says that this is really wrong, that this is the hate speech, you have to refrain from doing that. Of course, Japanese government have to really do what America wants them to do. Moreover, like it's empirically true that like Shinzo Abe, for example, Kishida, like they are really like controlled by America. Like they're really scared. Like their supporters of those people actually like America very much. Like this is like actually true. So I think that it's going to be extremely difficult if America says otherwise. And I think this actually dismantle their case from opening opposition and closing opposition. And finally, like they said that what did you say? What did you say? Sorry, I cannot really read my memo. Oh yeah, you said that it's going to be difficult for them to criticize America. Like first of all, I don't know why that's difficult. Like you can just fucking criticize America, right? And you don't really have to be scared of it. Like America won't be there to like kill you or whatever. It's a democratic country. Like you can criticize America on their side. Just by making it hate speech doesn't necessarily mean that their right of free speech will be infringed. Moreover, they know that America really cares about the fundamental human rights and the freedom of speech. It's just that this is akin to hate speech. Therefore, we have to refrain from using that. I think like constructive criticism of America will be welcome on either side of the house, and I don't necessarily think that people will be refrain from doing that. And on top of that, I think I think it's better to like that people like America to like support feminism or like other liberal ideology for those reasons. Politics have the here.
Thank you for that. The debate. Opposition debate.
All right. If we want to remember something important in history, just putting them on name of them in textbook is not enough. We want people to call the name, see these name in the public, and constantly remind of this this sort of thing. And making it hate speech is making it taboo. And I think we don't want that distance because it polarizes domestic political arena, causes massive amount of backlash, and I think this is worst possible choices ever. Key framing to put CO first in this debate is that the international community already understands how evil that of the Japanese colonialism actually was, regardless of the framing, whether or not they frame this as the hate speech or not. The main delta, therefore, will falls down to the how Japanese domestic political arena gonna be look like at the reflection of the framing coming from these types of international community. I think that is the most exclusive portion of impact in this debate. Then, what we actually able to substantiate in this debate is that this framing of hate speech will likely to provoke the massive amount of backlashes from the conservative portion of people within this kind of Japanese political arena, which is a massive number of people. And that's obviously bad because if they do something like demonstration part in Shibuya Street or somewhere, like, that there's massive media messages like in the coverage and like public narrative shaped based upon that sort of hatred, these types of stigma towards these kind of like they frame our history as these types of fucking like cancel culture, part of like stupid cancel culture, whatever. These types of like conservative narrative can be like weaponized against these type of things. That's clearly offensive to the people like Asian people live in Japan who saw that parade, who saw that who saw that set of opposing narrative exist in the domestic level in Japan, and I think international level impact is already actually doesn't matter because it's anyway symmetric in this debate. How this way against opening of petition? I'll take you in a minute. I think the opening of petition impact in terms of if we frame this as a hate speech, it's gonna lose we lose nuances, constructive discourses, and these types of things. But I think this is extremely uncertain as to me that what actually constructive discourses does something in the practical manner, and what types of discourse actually look like to begin with. I think our impact only contingent on how domestic Japanese political group likely to respond based on the framing done by international community, and why that sort of thing certainly carry out a significant amount of harm to these kind of specific groups of people living in Japan, and I think that is extremely certain impact compared to the opening of the ship. Before we move on, CG, yes.
I don't think this debate is about museums or any additive function of the words. Therefore, the idea of taboo is not important.
What the fuck? You see, firstly, they claim that Japanese people are ignorant and stupid and they don't know about anything past injustice about the warfare. Firstly, there's lots of access to the media, even for the foreign media in the current status quo. There's lots of information out there which is available for even for these Japanese people, especially younger generation. Secondly, obviously there's lots of external political pressure for the other countries to why you country not teaching these types of history in your country because you murdered our people in the past. And I think that sort of pressure does exist. If the siege mechanism relies on Japan so much care about international relations, that's why their politics is going to be changed based on the fear of backlashes from the international community. They should buy this mechanism as well, because that backlash is anyway likely to happen, and Japan will listen to them according to their mechanism. And thirdly, there are certain mechanisms in terms of people don't want to feel guilty or whatever, but there is no actual mechanistic link as to prove because people don't want to feel guilty. That's why they will, I think this mechanism is nothing because this just support our claim that people anyway wants to feel like they are. Our part of history is just legitimate. I think no, thank you. I think this actually does not prove their point. Then even if Japanese people get some knowledge, I think it is the critical point of closing government extension is people knowing something does not necessarily mean that Japanese government do something good to the society. I think there's huge logical leap in the species extension to that, educating people like the Japanese people knowing past injustice to the Japanese government or foreign affairs is going to be massively changed in a certain trajectory. I think that's huge burden. If they want to run that kind of crazy extension, I won't stop, but I don't think they can substantiate this burden quite well. Before we move on, yeah, Oji, go ahead.
The impacts that you're suggesting are two people or Japanese people that don't really know about the war. That's speculative. But what is objective is the people who have actually lived through the war or been comfort women themselves feel harmed when this rhetoric is weaponized and they internalize that it's bad. What is the weighing mechanism here?
The thing is whether or not these words are actually whether or not these are actually these words are used intended to offend these comfort women or not, and that is the matter of fact. I think this according to your bench's mechanism, Japan afraid of foreign affairs, afraid of backlashes from other countries, and it is actually unlikely for these Japanese government to explicitly condemn or stigmatize, antagonize these types of people to begin with. Quickly, Oji. I think Oji cases, if international community frame this as a hate speech, there will be more difficult and practical benefit. All of those practical benefits are simply symmetric. It seems that especially the East Asian countries already know and inherit the knowledge of the Japanese injustice to the enough extent. Firstly, because states have incentive to educate citizens to the certain way. Secondly, even if states won't do this, local community will do this and inherit knowledge of how Japan imperial was that bad and how many people are actually murdered in the village. And I think that knowledge is really, really accessible to the extent there is no enough meaningful extent of delta, whether or not they frame as hate speech or not. I think the most certain extent of the and most exclusive portion of the impact is EO's impact. We won't. Thank you.